Ray Dalio has spent more than 50 years studying how economies rise and fall. He built Bridgewater Associates into the largest hedge fund in the world, and along the way, he became known for a theory he calls the long term.
Debt cycle, it's worth understanding what he actually says, because a lot of what circulates online about it gets exaggerated or twisted into panic content. This isn't a countdown to doom. It's a framework, and like any framework, it has real insight and real limits. The basic idea starts with something simple. When people, companies, or governments borrow money, they can spend more than they earn for a while. That feels good in the short term. But eventually the debt has to be paid back with interest, and that means spending less than you earn later. Dalio argues this creates a natural rhythm, a short cycle of borrowing and repaying that runs about 7 to 10 years, which is roughly the length of a typical recession to recovery period. And underneath that, a much longer cycle, one that unfolds over roughly 75 to 150 years, as debt tends to grow faster than income, quietly building fragility even while an economy looks fine on the surface. Medium. In his book on this subject, Dalio breaks that long cycle into stages. Early stages involve what he calls hard money, meaning currency backed by something like gold. Later stages move toward paper money and eventually fiat money, which is currency backed by nothing but trust in the government that issues it. As one summary of his framework puts it, the later stages are marked by recurring debt crises, defaults, and currency devaluations, sometimes punctuated by bursts of inflation. In the final stage of the cycle, Dalio argues that investors stop believing the promises attached to government debt, the currency loses significant value, and the system experiences real economic stress, often alongside large wealth gaps, before the whole system resets and a new cycle begins. Medium. Where does Dalio think the United States sits right now? In recent interviews, he's been fairly direct about it. He's described the U.S. as being in what he calls stage 5 of his model, the stage that comes right before the more disorderly stages. He points to a combination of large and rapidly rising government debt, geopolitical tension that raises questions about the safety of the dollar, and a growing gap in income and wealth within the country that fuels political polarization on both the right and the left. In his view, those conditions tend to produce financial strain and political conflict rather than calm, negotiated solutions. Bridgewater Associates. Dalio isn't shy about the numbers he thinks matter. In public commentary this year, he's pointed to the relationship between government debt, income, and debt service payments as the core mechanism to watch, arguing that rising debt payments relative to income squeeze out other spending, and that eventually the pressure becomes unavoidable. He's also drawn a distinction that's easy to miss. A government's debt problem doesn't work exactly like a household's, because a government has one option a household doesn't have, which is that it can print more money. That's the crux of his argument. When debt gets too large to pay back the honest way, governments in his framework don't usually choose to default outright or restructure cleanly. They print money and let currency lose value gradually. That's a quieter kind of default, spread out over years instead of happening all at once. Raymond James. It's worth being honest about the scale of this too. U.S. federal debt is now in the range of roughly $38 trillion, which Dalio has described as putting the country in the late stages of a major debt cycle. That's a real, verifiable number, not a scare tactic. What you do with that number is where reasonable people disagree, the acquirer's multiple. So how does Dalio suggest people think about protecting themselves? He's been fairly specific in interviews, and notably more moderate than a lot of the content built around his name. Asked directly about gold, he said he thinks any portfolio should generally hold somewhere between 5 and 15% in gold, not that someone should go all in on it. That's a diversification range, not a doomsday allocation. His broader argument for gold isn't that it will make anyone rich. It's that historically, during periods when creditors start to fear a currency will be devalued, central banks and large investors have shifted part of their holdings into gold as a hedge, and he sees signs of that pattern happening again now. Raymond James Bridgewater Associates. He also emphasizes something less flashy than buying an asset, productivity. In his writing, he's repeated a few rules of thumb that are almost boringly simple. Don't let your debt grow faster than your income, because eventually that catches up with you. Don't let your income grow faster than your productivity, because that eventually makes you uncompetitive. And spend real effort trying to raise your own productivity, because over the long run, that's what actually creates sustainable wealth. for individuals and countries alike. None of th. That requires a countdown clock or a scary headline. It's closer to financial hygiene than a trading strategy. Now, it's worth putting this in context rather than treating it as settled fact. Dalio has been publicly worried about debt and currency devaluation for years, and predictions about exact timing of big cycle turns are notoriously hard to get right, including for people with his track record. Plenty of economists respect his historical pattern recognition work, but disagree with how deterministic he makes it sound, and markets have a long history of staying irrational, or staying calm, longer than doom forecasts expect. Gold, which he recommends as a partial hedge, also carries real downsides. It produces no income, its price can be volatile over shorter periods, and it has gone through long stretches of underperforming stocks and bonds. None of that means his framework is wrong. It just means it's one lens, not a certainty, and it shouldn't be the only thing anyone bases a financial decision on. If you want to actually think this through for your own situation, the useful takeaway isn't a specific asset to rush out and buy. It's the questions underneath it. How much of what you own depends on a single currency holding its value? How exposed are you if interest rates or inflation move in ways that surprise you? Do you have a mix of assets that would hold up differently depending on which of these scenarios actually plays out? Those are questions worth sitting with, ideally with a financial advisor who knows your full picture, not a video. This channel isn't affiliated with Ray Dalio, Bridgewater Associates, or any related entity. Everything here is drawn from his publicly available writing, interviews, and books, sourced and linked below, presented for educational purposes. This is not financial advice, and nothing here should be treated as a personal recommendation. Always do your own research and talk to a licensed advisor before making investment decisions.